Okay, this week we're doing bilingualism. Hopefully, we'll be able to dispel some of the myths that are propagated throughout society about bilingual children. So, the first fact that we should know is that more than half the world's children are bilingual. So, if you are a monolingual speaker, you are in the minority, and monolingual children are both very successful at learning languages. Many countries speak multiple different languages. There are some countries that have over 50 languages spoken. If you think about a country as large and diverse as China, whether you want to call them different languages or dialects, depending on your political beliefs, there are many, many different varieties in China. And most people who are not living in the main cities, like Beijing, for example, many will know multiple different dialects or languages. And it might not be just at home. Perhaps there's a language that's spoken at home, and then they learn another language or two at school for formality purposes. Maybe it's the language of the government. So there can be more quote unquote prestigious languages that are spoken not at home. Okay, so children acquire multiple languages in different ways, and we should separate them. For the most part, they behave very similarly, but there may be some slight nuances depending on which type you are. So simultaneous multilingualism, let's imagine there's like a spectrum here from 0 years to 11 years, give or take. Simultaneous multilingualism is like when you start learning two languages, A and B, at the same time, and you carry them both throughout your life. Maybe, there's some breaks in some language. For the most part, you're learning them at the same time. Sequential multilingualism is like maybe you learn A very early on, and then maybe at like 2 years old, you start to learn B, and then you carry them both together. And maybe there's some breaks every now and then in either one, but for the most part, you're starting them at different times. Okay. So this might happen if your child encounters a different language at school than at home. So maybe that's why it's sequential multilingualism for some children. And for simultaneous multilingualism, maybe you have parents that speak different languages and they're using different languages. Maybe you have a language at home, but then when you visit your grandparents or other family members, they use a different language. So, there's different reasons why you might acquire languages at different times. In general, you're not going to see too many differences before the age of 4. After the age of 4, you might start to see differences. Okay. So in general, usually one language is dominant, so they become fluent in both languages, but they're imbalanced. So one is still slightly better than the other. In other words, the vocabulary choices may be a little bit more advanced. The narrative structure or discourse structure might be a little bit more proficient, but it's fluency in both languages. So here's two basic hypotheses that we're going to carry through a little more than half this lecture, which is how bilinguals are learning their languages. So one is the autonomous systems theory. It's like you have language A and you have language B, and they're separate. So in other words, language A develops on its own and B develops on their own, and they don't interact with each other. The interdependent systems theory is saying, okay, we have two languages. They're both developing, but there's some transfer between them. So like there's these pathways where language A can affect language B, or language B can affect language A, either positive or negative. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It's just that they affect each other. So you can also call this the bilingual bootstrapping issue. So whether or not they use their other language to help them with something in one of their other languages. So the question is, which hypothesis is accurate? And initially, it seems like the autonomous systems theory is a little bit more accurate, and that's what Paradis and Ganassi are going to show. So let's start with a brief overview of what they looked at. Basically, what they're going to show is that children who are bilingual develop syntax and morphology with the same level of success as monolingual children. So in other words, if you have an English-French bilingual child and you compare them to an English monolingual speaker and a French monolingual speaker, the bilingual children will behave just as successfully as the monolingual children. Okay. So there's two ways that you might have an influence. So if let's say English is helping French out or French is helping English out, then you might expect the bilinguals to be as good as the monolinguals in both cases. But there's this other effect too that you could see, where let's say something in English is negatively affecting French performance because there is a contrast between something in their phonology or syntax or morphology. In which case, you might expect a bilingual to perform less than adequate on one of the two languages, or it might be vice versa, where French is inhibiting English. Okay, but basically, what they find here is that actually bilinguals and monolinguals are behaving the same. So, we're probably not going to see any influence here. So the experiment was analyzing 3 different kids at ages 2, 2 and 6 months, and 3. So I don't know if we've seen much of this terminology or notation yet. The first one is years. The second one is months. I tend to just use the words themselves because they're easier, but this is a shorthand way of looking at it. So they tested 3 aspects of French English bilingual children. So there's always some base information here first. So one is French monolingual children produce inflected verb forms correctly at age 2, while English children don't. They use uninflected forms. So in English, this is like the difference between he and I. If we were to say walks versus walk, a child at age 2 in English would say he walk, I walk. Okay. French children, the verb conjugation system is a lot more involved. So most nouns have gender and they need to correctly agree with the verb. So there's a lot of different forms. So French children tend to be okay with this at 2. So let's ask ourselves, what if there is influence? So if there is influence, then French should help English. Okay, because French monolingual children can do this at 2, therefore you have such a complex verb system that if they're bilingual and they know French pretty well, they should be able to transfer that to English, right? So English inflections with agreement here should be like really easy because we just have 2. Like, is it a third person singular S or not? Okay, so did we see this kind of pattern or maybe a negative pattern in this experiment? No. So we did not see this. For bilingual children, they, when speaking French, they use more inflected forms. In English, they use less inflected forms. So the bilingual children behave just like the monolinguals. So when they spoke English, they had issues. When they spoke French, they were fine. Okay, what about negation? So English negation, we usually put no before the verb. So not, eat, don't eat, did not eat, In French, you have this ne, je ne sais pas, ne, verb pas. So there's a pas marker that usually comes after. You can put it before. I don't know French too well, but because it's a multi-form thing, children might make errors and put the pas where the ne should be. Maybe they'll say it twice. But in other words, like you have a negation part on the left and the right before and after the verb. Therefore, French monolingual children are putting it before and after the verb. So in a bilingual child, if there was influence, what would you expect? Well, if there's influence, English put it after as well. Because French would be like, well, we can put it before or after. So if we're transferring over to English, then yeah, English can put it after as well. Which would be incorrect, but it'd still be transfer. So do we see that with bilingual children? No, we don't see that. So they use negation differently in French and English. So in French, they did it before and after. In English, they just put it before. Okay, what about pronouns? So pronouns in English with he and she, they need to use, they need to make specific gender associations with it. So there's gender associations like king with he, for example, or boy or girl with she. But there's also agreement errors. So we know that with walk, we saw this earlier. I'll just write it here again. With walk, when it's third person, with he or she, we need the S there, third person singular. Okay, so English children have these errors and French children rarely ever make these errors because, again, the complex verb system. But we're basically looking at the same thing as the first one, but just looking at the pronoun aspect of it rather than the verbal aspect of it. So if there's influence here, let's talk about what the outcomes could be. And let's do both outcomes this time. So maybe the English children has less errors. So sorry, not the English child. The English language and the bilingual child would have less errors because the French language doesn't make that many errors for these children. Or maybe it's the other way, and French has more errors. So the English is negatively affecting the French. So do we see either of these patterns for bilingual children? The answer is no, we don't. So no fewer errors in English, no greater errors in French. There's no influence here whatsoever. Um, there's no transfer. So in terms of this experiment in 1996, which theories is the experiment supporting? It's very strictly supporting the autonomous systems. So they're saying the systems develop in isolation. There's no transfer here whatsoever, whether it's positive or negative. Okay, but I mean, with adults, we know there's transfer when they learn a second language. In fact, this transfer effect is so strong, it can really hinder a lot. In fact, usually in second language acquisition, transfer is strictly positive, and there are different terms for negative transfer. So maybe something was missed. So Muller and Hulk said, well, maybe transfer only happens in like these very specific areas where either one, there's like a very difficult grammar point that is hard to get at. Like maybe it's something that involves discourse or something that involves pragmatic. So something that is non-literal or something that requires a whole conversation to understand. So you need to understand previous sentences. So, for example, it could be the difference between topic comment structure versus subject object structure. Okay, so maybe that's an area. Or maybe it's an area where there's some overlapping structures. Like maybe we're talking about when we can draw pronouns, for example. Or maybe it's something like relative clause formation. So something just, that might behave differently or the same depending on the language. So I say these because you assume, like, with principles and parameters, that there's like this light switch where pronoun drop either happens or it doesn't, but it covers the same thing and it's more complicated. With relative clause formation, maybe there's certain words that have to be included, like maybe the pronoun that you extracted has to be there or not. So, for example, sentence, I met the person who fought me. So in other words, we use who there. It's a complementizer, but then we don't repeat person here. Well, another language might say, I met the person who he fought me, where he is referring to the person. So in English, that's called a resumptive pronoun because you're putting it in where it shouldn't be. But other languages require something like this. So it's like an overlapping structure. Maybe it behaves the same, maybe it behaves differently, but maybe it's complex enough that there is some transfer here. Okay, so what Muller and Hulk did was they analyzed 3 bilingual children that spoke a Romance language and a Germanic language. So it's either like French German, Italian Dutch, French German, or so on. So it's like one of each. Okay, so Romance languages are more similar to each other. Germanic languages are more similar to each other. They're part of the same language family, so they don't deviate too much. So, but taking a look at these children, there's some things to note here. That is that German and Dutch allow object dropping. So in English, we can't do this. If we say, I know him, we have to say, I know him. We can't just say, I know, and then something in terms of the grammar or discourse fills in the blanks. Like we have to say him there. French and Italian do not allow it. So you need the object. So in terms of like how these are together, English is very close to French and Italian. German and Dutch have this extra thing. So what happens when these bilingual children speak German or Dutch? Well, when they're speaking German or Dutch, the bilinguals behave like monolinguals. So for Dutch and German, I'll explicitly write that here. What this means is that monolingual children are dropping their objects, and so are the bilinguals. So even if they speak French and German, Italian and German, French and Dutch, when they speak Dutch or German, they're doing the dropping. But what happens when they speak French, which do not allow object dropping? Now, according to what we've seen so far, these autonomous systems, the bilinguals should just behave like monolinguals. But that's actually not what happens here. The bilinguals drop far more often than the monolinguals for French and Italian. Okay, so obviously in French and Italian, you're not allowed to drop the object, but bilinguals are dropping it. Okay, so this points to say, okay, maybe there is some transfer here. We have some overlapping environment here. It is more complex because if you're dropping objects, you need to know context, you need to know discourse. So maybe this is a specific circumstance where transfer is there. This is some sort of interdependent system. Now you might be saying, hold on a second, they're dropping objects, but isn't that normal? And yeah, it is normal because of bottlenecking, right? Subjects get dropped, objects get dropped, objects get dropped a lot less. But the fact is, both monolinguals and bilinguals will drop the objects from bottlenecking, but bilinguals are dropping it more often. So it's not like only bottlenecking, it is also some sort of transfer from German or Dutch that's going into French or Italian when they speak it. So from here, it's like, okay, we now have this experiment that says, well, this one is saying it's an interdependent system. They're interacting with each other and they're affecting development, but it is nuanced. It is in these very specific circumstances where we have some overlapping phenomena. So it's not phonology affecting syntax. It's not subject, object, verb order affecting, whether or not the subject or object is appearing. It's the same phenomena. They're different and they're affecting each other. And it is somewhat complex in nature. It's not just like word order, SOV. You need discourse to be involved in there too. Okay. So we have like two experiments that show two different theories. So let's take a look at a couple more experiments and see if there's more support for one or the other. So I'll read these two first, and then I'll show you some behind the scenes thing that make this a little bit less obvious. So two experiments here. Paradis and Navarro 2003 found that an English-Spanish bilingual child omitted less subjects in Spanish than monolinguals. So the idea here is that in course in Spanish, you can omit subjects. So English, where you can't, is affecting the Spanish. So it looks like what we have is some transfer, or I guess in the L2 terms, we'd use interference in this case, but we'll just call it transfer. That's what we're going to call it. Yip and Matthews, 2007, found that Canto English children produce more in situ WH questions than English monolinguals. So Canto allows in situ. So to explain what this means, in situ just means that the WH word is wherever the subject or object would be. So you could say, you want what? While a moved version, which might be more natural for us, would be, what do you want? So you can kind of see the gap there where the original word came from. It moves up, but in the in situ, we're just replacing the object with you want food. So you want what? Okay. So it looks like there's some transfer here from Canto into English. Okay, so it seems like this interdependent systems is true. But there's some more details that these experiments, kept, of course. I'm hiding them from you, but the researchers didn't hide them from the readers here because there's, some nuance to this. One is for the English-Spanish bilingual child, they looked a little bit at the background of the kid's mother. So the mother was L1 English and L2 Spanish. So her first language was English and she learned Spanish later. And her Spanish was unique because what she did was she dropped subjects way less often than L1 Spanish speakers. So the question is here, is there's some transfer effect from English into Spanish going on that's affecting the dropping of subjects from the child, or is the child just copying the mother's language? Okay, so it's probably influence, not from English, but from hearing and getting the input from the child's mother. Okay, what about this Canto English children? This was not just one child, this was, multiple children in this study. And it turns out that if you look at all of the mothers, they were L1 Canto, L2 English. Okay. And what is happening here when these Canto English children are speaking English sentences and producing more in situ WH questions? Well, uh, they asked more in situ than L1 English. So the mothers, again, we see a very similar trend where it's the transfer interference effect on the adult's second language that is then being passed on to the child through input. So if we ask ourselves what's really happening, it's actually more likely that this isn't transfer, that we're not actually getting a lot of interaction between the two first languages, but instead it's more just the input from the parents. So overall, if we were to critique this model and ask ourselves, well, is the autonomous systems theory more correct or the interdependent systems theory? For the most part, it seems to be that a lot of this is autonomous, but there are just very specific circumstances or nuances where there is some transfer. So these studies are recent. These studies keep happening. There's more being developed, of course, all the time. But for the most part, we would now assume that these are developing independently with transfer in very unique circumstances. Okay, so that was a lot of morphology and syntax, but what about sounds? So just one quick slide on sounds. There's not too much to say about them. If we remember the timeline, we remember the cat in the hat study, we learned that children understand prosody. As soon as they're born, they're learning it quite early, and they do these high amplitude sucking tasks, and they show differences in prosody like 2 days after being born. They can distinguish sounds. And what we saw in the phonology lecture was that in this BD study, around 17 months of age, they were able to use phonological cues and distinguish the sounds within words. So if B was a crown and D is a molecule, they learn that, then suddenly they're switched. So now D is the crown and B is the molecule. At 17 months, children are like, hold on a second, that's not right. They can hear those differences in words. While at 14 months, they're like, oh, it's fine. So taking a look at these two studies, bilingual children with high amplitude sucking rates can differentiate sounds from both languages and understand prosody in both languages. So yeah, they're picking up both. They might not know that they're separate languages, but they're still acquiring those sounds and those different prosodic influences. And in terms of this BD task, they can do it in both languages. The only difference is that it takes an additional 3 months. So instead of 17 months, it's maybe 20 months in order to acquire it for bilingual children. So yeah, we might see a little bit of a delay in terms of when these skills are acquired. In fact, I wouldn't even call this a delay. I would just say it happens later in development due to the exposure to different languages and different sounds, often bigger inventories, perhaps less input from each language individually. It takes a little bit longer, but in the end, they still acquire it and they still perform just as well as monolingual speakers at this age. So overall, if we're taking a look at all of these different things that we've seen in terms of sounds, in terms of dropping, in terms of like different inflection systems, negation, all of these different forms, what we're finding is that learning multiple languages is not negatively affecting children. It might delay some things. It might take a little bit longer to get to the same point as monolinguals, but they're still getting there. And you're not hurting your child by exposing them to multiple languages. Okay. So with that being said, we may extend this claim, and this is another, maybe not extend this claim, but we may think about this generally and say, well, okay, if a child is going to acquire multiple languages, it doesn't really matter when they learn it, as long as it's before this certain magical age where the brain now says, okay, I'm an adult language learner. So we know that younger children are better at acquiring language than adults. So maybe this is all happening and it's okay before a certain age. So whether it's a 2-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, as long as it's before, like, say, 13, it's fine. But the reality is that this is not true. In terms of this magical critical period, so this is a term you might have heard before in Ling 100. We're not really using it too much in this course because the concept of a critical period is not a general thing that exists. It's more like there are certain critical periods for different aspects of language. So, for example, with phonology, if you take a look at bilingual learners, so someone who's trying to learn two languages, if they're younger than 4, they behave like monolinguals. So if they start learning a second language, whether it's simultaneous or sequential, maybe a third language, maybe a fourth language, as long as it's younger than the age of 4 that they start, they will behave like monolinguals. If it's older than 4, they're worse than monolinguals. So it seems like if we were to talk about a general critical period for when you can acquire a second language and have the same success as monolinguals, 4 years old is like the cutoff point for phonology. So maybe 4 years old is like a general cutoff point, but it's not true for figurative speech. So for pragmatics, for non-literal speech, it turns out that if you're younger than 11, you behave like monolinguals. If you're older than 11, so this is when you start learning your second language. If you start learning older than 11, you're much worse than monolingual. So if we ask this transition period of, okay, when does the child mind become an adult mind in terms of language acquisition? When did the struggles come in? There's no magical critical period for all language. There are different ages for different linguistic subareas. 4 years old is about the cutoff for phonology. We saw 1 year old, 1 year old for sounds. When we talk about sound discrimination in terms of tuning into your specific language, for figurative speech, pragmatics, these are more difficult. You get 11 years old. And your syntax and morphology. This is a lot more ambiguous due to just the general notion of what syntax and morphology is in some languages. So you might get like 7 to 9 years, depending on which study you look at. So yeah, there's no nice set critical period for when it's great to start learning a second language. It's more like when you start learning your second language, at what age? Like what aspects of language are you still going to be able to acquire native like fluency in, depending on where you start. So younger than 4, don't have to worry about anything. Younger than 1, obviously, is the best. You can repair sound discrimination, of course, 1, 2, 3 years old, and you can be as good. But again, we saw before, 1 years old, typically not that great. Sounds are not exposed to. But even before 12 years old, they can still have pretty decent success. Okay, when we talked about autonomous versus interdependent systems, we found something really interesting here, and that was that a lot of it is like maybe parental influence. So Gaskins was like, okay, I have 2 kids, they're bilingual. Why don't I do a study on them to see if parent input on some recording can actually explain the proportion of learned words. So for these English Polish kids, is the input from their environment and from us as parents affecting whether or not they're learning their language like usual? Okay, so let's remember some things. Most languages have a noun bias. English is one of them. We learn nouns before verbs. Some languages have verb biases. Polish shouldn't really have a bias for either because verbs and nouns are pretty equal in frequency. It's a free word order language. There's a lot of inflections. So English should have noun bias. Polish should really be somewhat equal. And of course, we know based on what we've seen before, there's usage-based effects, there's frequency effects. So when children hear something more, they tend to pick up that pattern and they can abstract it. Okay, so to set the stage, the father was English speaking, the mother was Polish speaking, 2 daughters, Sadie and Tessa. Sadie was older than Tessa. They first got some English and Polish at home for a year, and then they went to a nursery that was very English dominated afterwards. So English speaking nursery, English speaking school. So for the most part, after first year, a lot of the input they got was English. So could the recordings of English and Polish, have any effect on this learning here? Because if we think, okay, a lot of the input that they're getting is English, then First of all, in terms of word learning, nouns should be learned more than verbs. And even in Polish, because the English dominance is so prevalent, maybe we would also see a noun bias there. So maybe if we give them some Polish recordings, we won't see as much of that bias. Maybe Polish would behave a little bit more normally. So taking a look at their MLUs and word development over time, put a line there for when they started going to nursery and school, we do see an English bias for both kids. More words, higher MLUs compared to Polish. Okay, so even before they're going to nursery and being in this very English dominant environment, they still seem to have a slight preference for English in terms of learning. So what about the words that they're learning? Remember, English and Polish, English should be a noun bias, Polish should be relatively equal. So let's take a look at it. Stage 1 and 2. We'll compare these for both because they have data for both. Again, the children are different ages, so they ended the experiment at the same time, so they just compared what they had. Both children had a bias in English for nouns over verbs, although Tessa picked up slightly more verbs in terms of relative percentage than Sadie did. Okay, but overall, noun bias. In terms of the Polish lexicon, what we see here for Sadie is that there was a strong bias for nouns, but with Tessa, there was less so. It seemed to be pretty even with nouns and verbs. Now, why might this happen? Well, there's a detail I didn't give you that might explain things, and I held it so that way this could hopefully be a nice realization. In terms of the recordings that the kids got during their nursery visits, okay, so parents input a bunch of information to kids to talk to them. They would hear these during the nursery events. Sadie got an English recording and she got a Polish recording. Tessa only got a Polish recording. So if you think about the dominance between Sadie and Tessa in this environment at a nursery that is very heavy English, Sadie is getting both English and Polish from her parents and a lot of English from the environment, while Tessa is getting English from the environment and Polish from recordings from her parents at the nursery. So it's basically saying, okay, the parents can have some influence here because even though Tessa's in this very English dominant environment, just having like only Polish recordings is having an effect on the bias of the nouns and the verbs. It's still a noun bias, but it's getting a little bit closer to what we would expect from like a typical Polish monolingual. Okay, so in terms of the recordings that they got, what did the input look like? Like, what did the categories look like? So for Polish for both kids, there was definitely a verb bias in terms of the amount of words that were verbs compared to nouns. For Sadie, it's not that strong, but for Tessa, we do see a 5% difference. So 70 more verbs than nouns that were being spoken. In terms of tokens, it's a whole, again, double for both kids. So in terms of the recordings, they're hearing more verbs in Polish. And it seems that when you give just a Polish recording to Tessa, this is having an effect on word learning. Now, in terms of Sadie's English, we're getting more unique nouns than verbs, but in terms of how many there are appearing, we do get slightly more verbs than nouns. So overall, the English dominance with Sadie is very powerful, causing a lot more nouns to be learned. But this recording from Polish, from her parents for Tessa, seems to be having an effect and like reducing that bias. So okay, so recordings do seem to be giving some input. Is there any more information we can learn from this? Well, they took a look at the recordings that they gave each child in each language and broke it down a little bit into isolated words, words at the beginning or ends of utterance, and words in the middle. So isolation, Polish, more verbs than nouns, English, more nouns than verbs. At the beginning and end of utterances, Polish had more verbs than nouns, English had more nouns than verbs. For the middle of utterances, we see more verbs than nouns in both cases, which is expected in English because verbs typically come in the middle of an utterance. So based on what we see, it seems like the middle of utterances isn't really relevant, and we would guess that because of spotlighting, things we saw very early on in the course, where either isolated words can help or there's spotlighting at the beginning or ends of sentences. Okay, so the main point of this study is to show that, look, parental recordings do have influence on children's word learning. So even if they're bilingual, the environment has a big effect, and just hearing your parents speak in one specific language can, make things more monolingual like. So there was a noun bias in both languages. The proportions were different, but there were still more nouns being learned in terms of their raw numbers. There was an English dominance for both children. This is just only showing by the number of words they learned and by the MLUs. But the dominance for Sadie, who heard both English and Polish recordings with an English nursery school, the dominance by Sadie for nouns was much, much stronger than for Tessa, who heard just Polish recordings in an English nursery. Okay, so getting parental recordings in just one language that is not the dominant language you're in can transfer some of that learning. So some of the expectations. And it seems like a lot of the things that we talked about earlier with spotlighting isolation tends to be relevant as well, because the patterns are showing. If middle of utterances was useful, like was something they picked up on, then maybe we would see less of a noun bias in English, because we'd hear so many verbs in the middle, and there's so many of them. You've been taking a look at the total number of verbs being spoken. There are so many. Okay, so if we're talking about autonomous versus interdependent systems, it seems like they are just autonomous systems from most of what we've seen so far. Maybe for these nuanced areas with complex grammar points, there's some interdependence there, but for the most part, these are autonomous systems that are very much shaped by parental input. So, in other words, the parents, and not just the environment, but the parents themselves, are having a pretty big influence on a child's learning of one of the two languages or three languages that they would know. Okay, abrupt topic change. I had to pause the recording right after that last slide. So now I'm back. I couldn't remember what I said. But anyways, the last thing we want to talk about is this review from Genesee in 2008 that takes a look at bilingual errors. So we talked about some transfer effects, and the question is, well, why do these errors occur in the first place? Is it because children don't know that they have two languages? Like, is it unintentional? Is it intentional? Like, what exactly is happening in this case? So, this is a critique of this thing called the unitary language hypothesis in 1978 that is meant to explain why there are errors when children who are bilingual end up mixing languages when speaking to people. So there's this three-stage model that's proposed. One that says in the first stage, children have this shared vocabulary and shared syntactic structure. So they just don't know that there's two languages. They're just learning a bunch of words and they're putting them into this bubble, and they're just using these bubbles of words. The second one says in the second stage, children are now dividing it into two different vocabulary groups. So they're understanding that different people have different vocabulary preferences. They don't fully understand that there's two languages because there's still like a shared syntactic system. It isn't until the third stage that now we're saying, okay, there's actually two vocabulary bubbles, two syntactic systems, two phonological systems, and these are separate languages. So the idea is that when children make mistakes in languages and they borrow and they transfer and they do these weird things with like word substitutions, which is just like code mixing and code switching, it's because they're still in stage 1 or 2 and they just don't understand that they have two language systems. So is this true? And in general, no. We're going to see that it's not true with some of these studies here. So one took a look at the use of languages in bilingual children with their parents. So their mother was English dominant and their father was French dominant. So they're both bilingual, but they have preferences for which language they speak. They're better in either English or French. And they found that across all children, they tended to use English more with their mother and French more with their father. Although this isn't a complete 100 to 0, some children like Will and Jen here are still using the other language that is not dominant to their parents. So it seems like children very young, like 2, 3, 4 years, are still aware that there are multiple language systems, and they're tuned into preferences of their parents. Okay, what about with strangers? Okay, so maybe it's just like a parent thing because they get a lot of exposure to parents and they're like creating these vocabulary bubbles for each person. Okay, so then it's like my mother uses this bubble, my father uses this bubble. So therefore, like we're in stage two, we're just pulling from different bubbles. So with a stranger, what happens is, let's say a stranger speaks one of the child's two languages. A child will adapt to the stranger's L1 using their preference more so than the other language that they're familiar with as bilingual children. So that's most kids. Some kids, like Joe here, are a little bit different, not special, just different in the fact that um, they tried very hard to adapt to the stranger's L1, using it much more often than with their mothers or fathers. But in the end, they still use the other language more often. Now, the question is like, what is happening here? And this all comes down to confidence and dominance. So the idea was with this creature, this this kid, like Joe here, Joe has a dominance in the language that is not the stranger's L1. So if they're English French bilingual and the stranger speaking French, maybe Joe is just much better at English and much more confident. So Joe makes an effort to speak French, but just can't do it as well. So for the most part, Joe speaks English. So it seems like around this age, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old, children are very in tune with the fact they know that there are different languages and they do their best to adapt to speakers. So there is knowledge of two language systems in there, and they are able to connect the dots and say, okay, if this person is speaking this language, that means that they know that one. So I need to use the one that they know, unless I'm not confident, in which case I'm just going to say the other language I know and hope for the best, which is, what adults do when they travel. They speak slower in their own language to someone who doesn't understand it and like to pretend that speaking slower will somehow help the other person understand. Okay. So going back before I move on, if we're talking about errors in language and understanding the system, children just have preferences and confidence in what they know they can do. And if they have confidence in the language they speak and they know it well enough, they can adjust. So when they say the wrong language to the wrong person, in like a full total sense of using the entire language and not mixing words in, um, it's it's not because they don't understand that they have two different language systems. They understand that. It's just other factors that are affecting it. Looking into code switching, which is a little bit more interesting, let me explain what this code mixing is. Sorry, not switching. Mixing is when you might have a sentence like, I have the eggs, but for some reason you say, I have the oats. Okay, so you have full English sentence except for one word, which is being switched with another word. Okay, so this graph takes a look at code mixing, intra-utterance with other children. So children are playing with other children and they're seeing how often code mixing works with dominant and non-dominant languages. So it turns out if you take a look at this, so this is how often code mixing occurs. It's not a super high occurrence, but across all these children, we see that code mixing tends to occur more often with their non-dominant language than with their dominant language. So this isn't a trend for every person, but for most children here. So what we're getting from this is like, let's say there are language errors. So let's say like English and French, and you're trying to understand, does the child know that these are two separate languages? Okay, the answer is yes. They probably and very likely understand that they have two different languages. And the reason we know that is because of this difference between dominant and non-dominant intra-utterance code mixing. So the reason this happens more with the non-dominant language, again, is to do with confidence and potentially knowledge of the language. So in your non-dominant language, you might not have the word for something. So you make a substitution. And where's that substitution coming from? Your dominant language. Why would you do it less with your dominant language? Well, because you know your dominant language better. That's why the rate of code mixing is so much lower. Of course, it's going to happen, but it'll happen at a much less rate. So there are some exceptions like Ollie and Jen. Jen's probably very similar in both languages, knows them pretty well together, probably has an equal distribution. And Ollie, who knows what's going on with Ollie? Again, this difference is not super big. Really, what we're looking at here is Tanner, and William, who show a very big disparity. So, of course, not all children are the same, but if we're asking ourselves, on average, do children understand that they have two different language systems? The answer is yes, and evidence comes from how they adjust to speaking to their parents, adults, and how they code switch, or sorry, code mix. So if we take a look at some evidence of code mixing, we see this happens at like every single level. So it's not just words, it's phonology, it's morphology, it's syntax, it's pragmatics. So for lexical phrasing, brushing teeth with soap, we see a difference between German and Spanish here. With phonology, COTS, Swedish doesn't have that S at the end, but Estonian has KOS at the end, so they merge them together to make COTS. Piping, so they use pipe for whistle, and they use the ing suffix for whistling. House pink, here's some English phrase with French word order. So of course we'd say a pink house, but French would be house pink. And then some pragmatic there for attention between different parents. So despite the fact that mixing happens, despite the fact that there's some code mixing when speaking with children, there might be some failure to speak completely in one language with someone's preferred dominant language, if it's a stranger or parents. This doesn't mean that you have a disadvantage for being bilingual. This doesn't mean that they don't understand that they have two separate systems. It's simply like borrowing because I have a weakness here. I don't understand something. I'm missing something. And I'm just, substituting a word or substituting a phrase. So they still understand that they have separate languages. It's just borrowing. In other words, they're filling in a gap rather than, pulling from this pool that is just one consistent language. So, in other words, if we think about these stages that were proposed, where if we go back to the beginning here, the argument against this is that actually there is no stage two. There isn't a system here where suddenly there's like these two separate word pools but one syntax system where there's like this understanding that vocabulary and syntax are like completely different things. Vocabulary is separate, but syntax is the same. The idea is that we go from stage 1, 2, 3 directly, if it does exist, if this hypothesis is correct. We don't understand that there's necessarily separate languages very early on, but very quickly we understand that the two systems are completely different and like they're different isolated systems, then they can autonomously develop. And maybe if we do see any transfer, it's not transfer, it's just code mixing. You forget how to say something, so you borrow it from the other language that you know in order to fill in the gap, so that way you can still communicate. Okay, so that was one of the big critiques from Genesee when looking at this review. The other thing is that code mixing happens with adults too. So saying that these are like errors with children is weird. It's not errors, it's just mixing. It happens with children and adults. Okay, and it's not like adults are still in this stage 2 in this 3-stage system. No, they would be going straight to the 3rd stage, like many, many very young children, but they just code mix. And yeah, final result is even at 2 years old, they know there's two languages and they switch to the proficiency of the listener. So it comes with syntax, it comes with vocabulary. There's not this weird stage where suddenly it's just vocabulary switching with some syntax system. No, like it starts maybe as one big blob, but it separates very quickly into two systems at a very, very young age. Okay, so that's it for bilingualism with the video. Hopefully the topic jump wasn't too bad. In class, we'll talk about the language game and critique.